All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining us on what is a very busy and exciting day at the law school. A lot of stuff going on. Glad you chose to be here with us. My name is Joseph Blocher, and along with Daryl Miller, I am the faculty co-director of the Center for Firearms Law here at Duke. Andrew Willinger here is our fantastic executive director. We are really thrilled to be co-sponsoring today's event with POLIS, the Center for Politics at Duke, which is dedicated to, among other things, strong political research, building rich political discourse and public discourse, and helping students find on-ramps to public service, which is a nice sort of preview of things we'll be talking about here today. Up here with me, I'm very glad to be joined by my friend Kristen Goss. Professor Goss teaches at the Sanford School of Public Policy, wears a lot of different hats, directs, among other things, our Duke in DC program. But relevant to today's conversation, she is also author of what I think of as the best two books on gun law, gun policy and politics, rather. Disarmed, The Missing Movement for Gun Control in America, and this book, which my students will recognize, Gun Control, What Everyone Needs to Know, co-authored with her fantastic colleague, Phil Cook. But the reason for bringing us all together today is our distinguished graduate and guest of honor, Dave Trott, who I'll briefly introduce, and then we're going to have conversation up here and leave time for Q&A at the end. Dave, who said we can call him Dave, is a graduate of the Duke Law School class of 1985. He's had an amazingly distinguished career in law and business and politics, only some of which we're going to get to talk about today. But for those of you who are interested and want to hear more, I highly recommend hopping on YouTube and looking up Dave's conversation a couple years ago with our former dean, David Levy, as part of the Lives in the Law series, which includes some pretty awesome remembrances of Dave's time here, including a colleague who I won't name, maybe Dave will, smoking a cigar underneath the no smoking sign next door. Professor. 34. Professor, yes, sorry. Still on this faculty. This is probably a profound point about the indeterminacy of text and, how you can get around even seemingly clear rules. But today we're going to be focusing on Dave's time in politics, which I believe started probably 1987 when you served on the city council, I guess as would be the equivalent, township council, back home in Michigan. And then fast forward 30 years later, Dave was walking the halls of Congress as a two-term member of the House of Representatives representing Michigan's 11th district for the 2014 and 2016 terms, and then in 2018 decided not to run again, but has remained a major figure in Michigan. We'll get to talk about that sort of as well. I just want to say as a framing to emphasize the name of today's panel is really important. That we're focusing on legislating gun policy, which for us is really exciting. At the center and here in the law school, we've had lots of events where we get to talk about the enforcement of gun laws, the adjudication of gun laws, like their constitutionality under the Second Amendment, all really, really important. But that's sort of just the executive and the judicial perspectives, and we very rarely, in fact, I think never have had a chance to talk to somebody who's actually sort of in the trenches drafting the kinds of laws and policies that govern us. So that's going to be our main focus for today. With that, maybe I'll turn it over to Kristen. Get us started.
I'm going to go off script right at the start. Could you raise your hand if you think at some point you will run for a public office? So not the majority. So Dave, first question. You can see that we have this amazing group of people who would be excellent public servants in elected offices. Tell us, after your long career in business and the law, why you decided to run for Congress, with an eye toward perhaps persuading some in the room to think about it.
Thank you both for having me here today. I would. But for my commitment to be here today, I'd be running for speaker in Washington, but that's all coming together as we speak, perhaps, which has been a complete debacle. I enjoyed my business career and I enjoyed my legal career, but in kind of a strange occurrence, in 2012, a guy named Kerry Bentivolio ran for Congress in Michigan, and he ran in the Republican primary against an incumbent by the name of Thaddeus McCotter. McCotter had been there for about 10 years. And in Michigan, to get back on the ballot, you have to get 1,000 to 2,000, at least 1,000, those signatures of people in your district who are registered voters who want your name back on the ballot, even if you're an incumbent. And McCotter turned it over to his staff, and they turned in 1,900 signatures, which was plenty of signatures. You can turn it up to 2,000. And problem is about 1,200 of those signatures were Xerox copies of the petitions that he had turned in 2010. So that caused him to be kicked off the ballot. Bentivoglio was the only person left in the ballot. He won, and he was thereafter called the accidental congressman. The thing about Bentivoglio, true story, is he believed he was Santa Claus. He raised reindeer, believed he was Santa Claus, and he was just a wackadoodle. And so I said to my wife, if I'm ever going to run for Congress, and I had been involved politically with McCain and Romney, I said now's the time because this guy is not the right person to represent our district. If you are going to run for office, though, I have some advice for you. All joking aside, go negative early. So, and I can tell you the story behind that. It's a little bit of a cynical reflection on political campaigns, but it is good advice for you, unfortunately.
Okay, great. Well, we will probably return to that topic, but we are here to talk about guns. So we're wondering if you could talk just in general terms about your, prior to entering Congress, your personal background and of guns, with guns, and maybe your views of gun policy and gun issues generally.
Sure. So I'm not a gun guy. I don't own a gun. I'm not a hunter. I understand why people enjoy hunting, perhaps, killing animals. But I'm not a gun guy. My district was a pretty strong Second Amendment district. So especially the western part of the district in Oakland County, a lot of gun ranges and a lot of Second Amendment, NRA folks. My view on gun safety and gun control is I have a different view than the majority opinions in Heller and Brune. I don't agree with Scalia, and I certainly don't agree with Clarence Thomas's convoluted logic in Brune. It's unworkable. I think there should be reasonable restrictions. And, just like the government can tell us to wear a seatbelt and do other things, and there's other limits on our constitutional rights, I don't think it's unreasonable for someone to have to go through a process to get a gun. And I think common law should govern that. It's not a constitutional right, in my opinion, for private ownership or public carry. And so I got to Congress, and really, I was on the Judiciary Committee. Served actually with Mike Johnson, who's probably going to be our next speaker in the next hour or so. And a smart guy, extremely conservative, so he's going to create all kinds of problems for the party, but that's another discussion for another day. Bob Goodlatte was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Bob Goodlatte is a very, very conservative congressperson from Virginia, a strong Second Amendment guy, and he made it very clear to the Republicans in the committee, we're not doing anything on gun control or gun safety. There's not going to be any bills that are going to be promulgated or we'll ever have a committee hearing on. And I was disappointed in that because I thought there were steps we could take that would be good steps in light of the violence in our country and the terrible tragedy that happens, every day.
So the fact that you weren't going to have any votes may render this question obsolete, but I'm curious what it felt like to you being kind of a moderate or centrist on the gun issue to represent a district that had a significant pro-gun constituency. And, how did you ever have to manage, maybe conflicts between your views and some of your more active constituents? And if I wanted to tack that on, you mentioned there's a pro-gun area. I think that the pro-gun violence prevention movement has been gaining strength since I wrote that book in early 2000s, becoming more organized around the country. And I'm wondering if you noticed anything like that in the kind of the balance of views that you might have heard about guns in your district.
It certainly has become more organized, and the young people in this country have become more organized and energized over gun violence and gun safety issues. I have to tell you, though, it hasn't hit the halls of Congress yet. Mm-hmm. If you want to sit down and talk about, the example, and I know we're going to talk about this, but it's the best example I can think of, so we'll talk about it now. So, you had the terrible, worst mass shooting in our nation's history in Las Vegas. 58 people were killed. 850 people were injured. And the week after that, I was on the House floor, and I walked up to Kevin McCarthy, who was then the majority leader. I said, Kevin, I'm going to introduce a bill. I got a bunch of bipartisan sponsors to ban bump stocks. Didn't seem like a big leap of faith for me. I mean, I don't think people should be walking around with machine guns. That's what it is, right? That's what it is, even though the Fifth Circuit said it isn't a machine gun. It's a machine gun. And I said, I'm going to introduce the bill. And Kevin's exact words to me were, Dave, hold off. Let me check with the NRA and see what their position is going to be. Okay. So, and then my chief of staff was from the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. Big gun guy. My legislative director was from Saginaw. She owned about 10 guns. So my staff is telling me, what are you doing? Don't do that. And so I'm a little conflicted at that point. And so I said, all right, I'll wait for Kevin to tell me what to do on this. And I'm going to be a good soldier. And, I'm not Matt Gaetz of the world. I'm going to kind of do the right thing here. And so I stood down and he came back and he's a week or two later said, don't do anything. The NRA is not on board yet. The president's going to try and do something through a rule making to solve the problem. And eventually, after much discussion, Trump and the NRA came to some agreement, and he did promulgate a rule to get rid of bump stocks, which the Court of Appeals are now divided on. It may or may not go to the Supreme Court. But to your earlier question, so I'm not a gun guy. I have a different view of the Second Amendment than certainly the NRA does. Don't agree with the two most recent cases that, with the majority opinions in those cases, completely disagree with that. The Scalia, he talks about the first 13 words of the Second Amendment in Heller, right? If his reading of that, and he's a bright guy, he did a lot better in constitutional law than I did with Wally Dellinger in this room, perhaps. But if the first 13 words of the Second Amendment are what Scalia believes them to be, then what they should be saying is nothing about militia and free states. It should be in order to protect oneself, provide for one's self-defense, comma, the right to bear arms shall not be interfered with, right? That's what it should be. It should say, in my opinion. But anyway, so how do you vote? You got a district that's strong Second Amendment. I'm not a gun guy. Well, and you probably studied this in your political classes. There's 5 ways you can vote when you get to Congress. You can vote your conscience. You can vote your district. You can vote what's best for your country. Sometimes those are different. When we were voting on the trade TPA for President Obama, my Ford Motor is the largest employer in my district. They are very much opposed to giving President Obama authority to negotiate a trade agreement with the 11 nations in the Pacific Rim. But I voted in favor of giving President Obama that authority because I thought it was best for our country because China's not going away. But you can vote your conscience, you can vote your district, you can vote your country, you can vote the way leadership wants you to vote, you can vote what's best for your party. Sometimes that's different. And so on gun issues, I voted my district. And if I went back there, if I ever got back to Congress, I probably would perhaps do it differently. But I voted the way leadership in my district expected me to vote. Didn't get me anything. Maybe I wasn't primaried as a result of it, but that's about all it got me. Anyway, I'm babbling now, sorry.
I actually want to ask a follow-up question to that if I can. So the Las Vegas shooting, I'm sure many remember how it felt when you heard the news. This is October 1st, 2017, during your, I guess, second term at that point. And others of you will remember, if not that one, some other mass shooting that you saw reported or that you were close to. Like, when you're in that role, how does that news, do you remember where you were? How does that news hit? What goes through your mind as a citizen, at that point a father, I don't know if you're a grandfather yet, and as a legislator who's like, what's the initial reaction? How do you process news like that, maybe differently from those of us who are in different roles?
Well, you feel like you got to do something, and you're serving in Congress, so you have an opportunity to do something. And so I thought it would be a no-brainer. I thought that the Congress would immediately take steps to ban bump stocks. I didn't think that was a tall order, and I thought it would be the NRA couldn't possibly oppose it, and but no one in Congress has read, with the exception of maybe Jamie Raskin, no one's read Heller or Bruin. No one knows what those cases say. Mike Johnson, our new speaker, not a fan, says he's a constitutional lawyer. I doubt he's read the cases. Maybe he has, but so no one. Everyone has a knee-jerk reaction, not based on anything to do with the Second Amendment. They got a knee-jerk reaction based on where's the NRA, and then what's the concern about? Why would someone be worried about the NRA? Anyone have an idea why? If you're in a Republican district and you're not voting the way the NRA wants you to vote, why would I be concerned?
They could run attack ads against you. They could mobilize their kind of very vocal supporters to say, hey, this guy's not with us on guns, and try to define your entire campaign around whether or not you are in line with your district on guns.
You were one of the people that raised your hand. You're running for office, so you're all set. You're good to go. So you.
I'll get that in a campaign ad sometimes.
You're not worried that the NRA is not going to max out and give you $5,000. my campaigns were $5 million apiece, right? And when I chose not to run in 2018, Kevin McCarthy, I'm going to digress here because it's a great story, but it's verbatim true. Kevin McCarthy pulled me aside in the House floor and he said, Dave, you had an easy reelect in 2016 because your opponent was weak, didn't spend any of his own money as promised. But in 2018, midterm election with a Republican in the White House, you're going to be a target for the Republicans. Your race between both committees on each side and the dark money is going to be a $20 million race. I said, what? He said, so you just go across the street to the NRCC and dial for dollars. Don't worry about your committee work or legislating. We'll give you a nice bill to protect widows of firemen so you can get reelected for your commercials. Just go dial for dollars. If you do your part, we'll help you. Well, I hated raising money. First campaign, I self-financed. That was easy, right? Then my wife said, hey, we're not doing this every 2 years, so just don't do that. And he was right. It was a $20 million race, and the Democrat won by 7 points, right? So anyway, the NRA, you're not worried about the $5,000 in a $5 or $20 million race. What you're worried about is they're going to say, oh, you're not playing along, Trott. We're going to spend $1 million of dark money to take you out and get you primaried. And by the way, we've got a mailing list of all the people in your district, and every single one of them have a flag somewhere on their car, and every single one of them vote. So you're gonna lose because you're gonna be primary, and that's really at the heart of the problem. The 18 to 24-year-olds don't vote, so they may be all worked up about the school shootings. They don't vote by and large. Every member of the NRA, I'm going to suggest to you, votes.
One of the things that's really interesting, you mentioned this earlier about the grounds on which you might vote, conscience, et cetera, party being one. And one of the things that I've learned from Kristen's work over the years is just how big the gap has gotten between Republicans and Democrats on guns in particular. It's, I think the number I remember from your most recent book is, if you ask the question, is it more important to protect gun rights or regulation? The gap between the two parties is about 50 points now. That dwarfs abortion, affirmative action, like any other sort of political issue. And that's relatively recent, the past few decades. It's grown. It's always been there, but it's really grown. Is there anything you can, was that consistent with your experience, that it was a pretty party line thing? The thing I'm building here too, of course, is that you are one of the people who's crossed party lines on this. As a Republican who's worked with bipartisan groups on gun reform, that's a pretty rare breed.
More since I left. I mean, Governor Whitmer, and our Democratic governor in Michigan, after the Oxford high school shooting years two ago, and then the shooting at Michigan State, introduced 13 bills in the legislature. And I had published an op-ed in the Detroit Free Press talking about the fact that this Congress will do absolutely nothing on gun safety issues, zero chance of it, because the Republicans are in control. And if any state or community wants to get anything done on gun safety, there better either be a state-led initiative or better be a petition to put something on a ballot initiative. And I published that in January. The next month, there was a shooting at Michigan State, a tragic shooting, and Governor Whitmer reached out, and I helped her. I was the only Republican helping her on her 13 bills dealing with safe storage, universal background checks, and red flag laws. All of them were signed into law in April and May of this year. And here's the point of these. They may not make a difference. Might not do a damn bit of good, but it might. So you need to try it, and it's not that. It's a compelling state interest, and it's not that big of a restriction to make someone, you go through a greater ordeal to get a driver's license than you do a gun, right? Anyway, there's all kinds of issues that are incredibly polarized in Washington. Unfortunately, I see, like on immigration, all kinds of ways immigration could be negotiated, right? There's so many different trading cards that the Republicans, the things that are important to the Democrats are different than the things that are important to the Republicans, and you could trade some of those things, and you could get immigration done. Hard to do given this MAGA environment we're in, but it could be done. Our spending problem, $33 trillion in debt, $2 trillion deficit. There's all kinds of ways you could get that done, in my opinion. Get some tax increases, you get some spending cuts, you get a balanced budget amendment, and now all of a sudden we're back on some fiscal sanity. Guns, the Republicans, either out of fear of being primaried or a fundamental misunderstanding, in my opinion, of the Second Amendment, believe the right is absolute. And therefore, there's nothing to talk about. You can't have a conversation with most Republicans about guns because they're like, well, I have an absolute right to. And because of the composition of our Supreme Court and the recent cases, there's going to be more and more deregulation. So, I fully expect the next time I'm back here visiting, someone, maybe it's already allowed in North Carolina, but I fully expect someone 5 years from now, I'll be sitting here with a rifle, well, the school bans it. And
Duke does,
It's a sensitive area. But,
Duke does. It's harder for the public schools.
But, what area is not a sensitive area today?
Mm-hmm.
Right now, they see schools and churches. Well, Walmart's a sensitive area. So I don't want to see someone walking through Walmart with a rifle on their back or a gun strapped to their. My wife walked into Panera to get us a cup of coffee a few months ago, and there was a guy standing, this is Birmingham, Michigan, standing in front of Panera holding a handgun. And my wife, and she's not a shrinking violet by any means, she's an attorney, he was assistant attorney general, and she walked in and kind of gave the guy a disgusting look like he's a complete moron. And she's walking back out, and the guy stopped her and said, you gave me a dirty look when you're walking in. I have a right to carry this gun, and you've got nothing to say about it. And she said, I have no idea why you would have a gun out in public like this. And then she walked away and thankfully wasn't shot. So.
You mentioned it. I can't resist asking this or mentioning this. So you mentioned taking constitutional law from Walter Dellinger, our very distinguished former colleague, my former boss at O'Melveny and Myers. Wally D. argued, of course, District of Columbia versus Heller, unsuccessfully for the district. The very first event we ever had at the center actually was Walter sitting at this very table, sitting where you're sitting. And I can't resist asking, I guess, this is going off script a bit, you've mentioned how people invoke the Second Amendment as this kind of absolute right. Do those kind of cases, holding aside whether anybody's read them, do people in Congress or in these public debates end up invoking the Constitution like the courts hold this out? Like, is constitutional rhetoric part of the moves there? It's sort of like it's an absolute right. What part of shall not be infringed don't you understand? Or is it more like policy that is never gonna work?
Again, I don't think most of my colleagues invoke the Constitution because, they bring it up a lot, but it's they bring it up as obviously a very important document that all of their political beliefs are grow from. But no one in the context of actually, I'm not even. We never talked about gun safety laws. Okay, it never came up in our Republican conference meeting. It was never a topic of discussion. So no one ever brought up the Constitution because we weren't going to do anything on it.
Yeah, and I should mention here that that I'd sort of raised earlier, bipartisanship hardly ever happens on guns. We do have the one counterexample happened after your time, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was passed within days and signed into law within days of the Bruin decision coming down. Not really changing a whole lot in terms of what's legal and illegal, but provides a lot of money. Did you see that one come in?
Well, when I followed it, I wasn't there when President Biden signed it, and it was the first meaningful work on gun safety laws in 30 years. It was bipartisan, marginally. In the Senate, there were 65 yes votes. There were only 15 of those were Republicans. In the House, there were 220 Democrats and 14 Republicans. So, the Governor Whitmer's legislation, she describes it as bipartisan. She, I think, got one member of the Republican side to vote for one of the 13 bills. So it wasn't bipartisan. But no, I think the Bipartisan Safe Communities Act is a good start. It puts a lot of money into mental health, puts a lot of money into block grants for that, money into $750 million for states that want to put in place red flag laws. It makes it more difficult for someone under 21 to get a gun. Redefines, I think, the licensing requirements for a federally licensed gun deal. So there are a lot of good things. It's a start. Again, I think it should be very cumbersome for someone to get a gun in this country. We have more guns than people, so that's just where I come from. And I don't think that's an unreasonable. Now, the NRA and the far right would say, well, if you make it too cumbersome, then places like New York and Illinois and California and all the liberal places in the country are going to make it impossible for people to get guns. And so that's a counter argument. But again, we have courts where eventually you can get your gun if you want it. And you probably already have 8 guns, so you don't need another one.
Can I just follow this thread instead of going, okay, so you're pre-answering some of our questions, so giving us some space. Sure. So I'm a political scientist, and I've been thinking a lot about whether the incentive structures that surround people in public office or political elites are out of whack in such a way that they're not allowing people to be their best true selves. And you mentioned primaries. Do you think if we could magically wave a wand and eliminate primaries. Would that free up people to create more, find more points of consensus, have less kind of effective negative partisanship? This team hates the other team. And, maybe do kind of better legislating for kind of the majority of people who are maybe not on, the extremes, move the football. And then kind of a corollary to that, what's wrong with legislating to the loudest and most organized constituency, the people who care the most? So maybe, you may want background checks, but you have a well-organized, vehement, pro-gun constituency that really sees this as a threat to personal rights and maybe even democracy. Why shouldn't they prevail over people who may not feel it as strongly? So those are my two.
Well, I think when the loudest voice in the room gets all the attention, more often than not, nothing gets done. So, the speaker race is a good example. I mean, the Freedom Caucus won. The Matt Gaetzes and the Jim Jordans of the world won. And so what that will mean is, certainly for the balance of this Congress, what is this, the 117th Congress maybe, or 118, I don't know. The balance of this Congress, nothing's going to get done because whatever legislation comes out of the House is not going to be able to get 60 senators to support it. Well, I disagree with that. I think instead of members coming home and saying, this is what I stopped from happening, I think they need to come home and say, this is what I accomplished. Might not be perfect, but we'll keep working on it and try and make it perfect. But, in business, we never had, our first solution was never perfect, rarely. You tweak it and you have meetings, try to figure out a better way to do something. So I think more often than not, when the NRA dominates things, especially if they're taking an unreasonable position, then nothing is going to get done. The part of the problem is that it goes deeper than this conversation can go, perhaps. But everyone blames the politician. They're not allowed to be the best they can be, and the primaries are a problem and everything else. I think, especially with the MAGA movement, I think there's a fundamental problem among our voters and our population. I mean, I think people are frustrated. I think people feel marginalized. I think people are angry, and so they lash out at politicians, and I think it's a function of that. And I don't know if people feel threatened by the world economy or what, but I think it's I think when people say, "Oh, these people in Congress are to blame for everything," no, I think we're all to blame for it. I think we're the ones that sent them there, and if people voted, if the moderates voted as much as the extremes in each party voted, then we'd get different people representing us, and we'd have a different dialogue and discussion about what was being done in Washington. But I think at the end of the day, and my district director told me to stop saying this because I would come home and my first year in office, I'd be doing speeches to the Kiwanis Club or different groups, and the people more often than not, people say, "Hey, what's it like, Dave? What's it like?" And I said, it's actually incredibly hard work. Which it was. I mean, I had 2 foot surgeries. My back always hurt. I was tired all the time. And I worked harder there than I ever did in business. And I worked hard, creating a company with 2,000 people, but I had and then I said, the other thing too is, there's some slackers there, but there are a lot of good people there for the right reason, trying to do the right thing. And they're not all a bunch of morons like you think. And the polling data supports me in that, because people say, what do you think of Congress? And 9% of the country respects Congress. What do you think of your member? Oh, he or she is a good person. I like my person. There's the proof, in my opinion. Well, finally, my district director pulled me aside and said, Dave, you got to stop saying that. First, everyone thinks it's the cushiest job in the world, so stop whining about how hard it is. And so I don't think I'm whining, Doug. He goes, no, you sound like you're whining. And second, he said, don't talk about how great the people are there, because most people think they're a bunch of idiots, and you sound like you're drinking the Kool-Aid already, so stop doing that. And I said, okay, fine. So, anyway, I don't know if I answered your question, Kristen.
Can I sneak in a follow-up to it? So this interestingly ties back to something you talked about with David Levy years ago, about your experience sort of with the problem solvers and the sort of, a subset of Congress people who were really like, let's think about I don't know, your mode seems to be problem solving. Let's identify something, figure out what works and what doesn't work. And I wonder, it feels to me as an outsider here that gun violence doesn't get framed as a problem in that way, like something that's subject to being solved. I think for a lot of people, this is the world we live in. This is the price of freedom. Am I right about that? And if so, do you have any sense about why? Like, why can't we see this like a public health problem or something else that we could marginally improve, if not solve?
So, for the record, the professor was George Christie that was smoking, but the no smoking sign.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that for some of you, that doesn't surprise you.
He's a profound jurisprudence, making a point about language.
Yeah.
Gun violence as a problem. Why don't we
so
see
here's the can. So you fly into town on Monday or Tuesday. You have votes at 6:30 on Monday or Tuesday night. They have those. They're ceremonial votes. They're not important votes, but they do that to make sure everyone gets back in town for their committee hearings on Tuesday or Wednesday morning. Right? Forget this whole speaker now. That's upset the schedule tremendously. And if you're there on a Tuesday morning or Wednesday morning for a committee hearing, at 8 a.m, you meet in the basement of the Capitol for a conference, Republican conference meeting. So 220 of us would go into the basement of the Capitol. It's an hour-long meeting, never longer than an hour. Half an hour of Boehner or Ryan telling us what we're going to do that week, McCarthy telling us when we're going to vote, Scalise telling us the messaging surrounding the votes, right? And inevitably, and then you have a half an hour of open mic where you can go for 1 minute and say whatever you want to talk about, right? Which is fascinating to sit there and listen to these people. And everyone has to hear themselves talk, so the line usually is pretty long. And so inevitably, once a month or something, there'd be some school shooting and there'd be discussion. We'd open the meeting with a prayer for the terrible tragedy, and then the messaging surrounding that would be, now remember, this is a mental health problem. It's not a gun safety issue. It is a mental health problem, right? Okay, but I think that's a fair statement that clearly someone goes in and shoots up a public place like a school, has a mental health problem. That's not a big leap for me, right? So what are we going to do about it? And so the Republican answer was always, we're gonna solve our mental health problem. Well, if solving a mental health problem was an easy thing to do, then I would say, by all means, that's obviously the solution. Let's put more money and resources behind mental health. But you can put all the money and the resources behind mental health in the world, and you need all kinds of things to kind of fall in place for that person to get the help they need. They need to first acknowledge they got a problem. They need to get some good help, and that takes years. So to solve it by saying it's a mental health problem, we're going to work on mental health, it's not a gun safety issue, is disingenuous. It's a stupid answer, in my opinion. And so that was always the Republican. I don't know, Professor, I'm responding to your question. That was always our answer, was it's a mental health problem. That's why it was maddening to me when the Republicans would push back, especially in the state of Michigan, when I was trying to help the governor get these bills across the finish line. All of the Republicans, I called 20 members of the state house and probably 15 state senators and helped to try and get a bipartisan support for these 13 bills for Whitmer. And we talked about the red flag laws, and they'd say, "Oh no, there's due process issues there. There's due process issues." Well, there's I thought the bills did a good job of having a prompt hearing and a prompt adjudication of whether you should have your gun taken away. So I didn't think there was due process issues. But if it is a mental health problem, don't you think a red flag law is a good first step? You got someone who's perhaps got a mental health problem, let's take the gun away and figure out if they should have their gun, right? If you really want to solve the mental health problem, let's start there. That's a good place to start, right? Yeah.
On that one, I have to just quickly shout out the excellent work that our other colleague across campus, Jeff Swanson, has done, also a faculty affiliate of the Center for Firearms Law, showing just how many lives could be saved by exactly the process that Dave describes. Red flag laws, for anybody who doesn't know, allow guns to be temporarily removed from a person whom a judge has determined presents an immediate risk to themselves or others. And the primary objection, although no court thus far has agreed with it, this is back to the rhetoric versus law point, is that they violate due process. So,
and since we're speaking for Jeff Swanson, I think he would also point out that the vast majority of people with mental health disorders are not violent or are at greater risk to themselves than to other people. And we could solve all mental health issues in this country and reduce violence by a minuscule amount. So very important to corrective.
The mental health problem in this country has gotten a lot worse, obviously, in the last 50, 60, 70 years. The cause of it, in my opinion, or at least what started the slide, is in 1962, John Kennedy correctly said, we're going to address our mental health problem in this country by decentralizing the funding and care and push this back to the states and the local communities so they can do it better than the federal government. I agree with that. My mantra when I was running for office is the best government is closest to home. You can go into that school board meeting and you can say, you look at the school board and go, I'm not happy with what you're doing. You can write your congressman about something and it's not going to move the needle, right? So I agree with what John Kennedy did in 1962. Problem is, the money never followed. So it was never funded.
That raises an interesting question too about gun law and policy, since we're kind of talking both about what happens at the federal level and at the states. What kinds of gun laws do you think are appropriate for the federal government to be passing versus the state and local government? So you mentioned earlier, and I've been loving this. You've invoked so many constitutional law things here. Heller and Bruin. You said compelling government interests earlier, which that's con law 101 for the one else who had it from me in this room. But you talked too about sensitive places, which is a part of the kinds of gun laws that Heller and Bruin both say are okay. Should we have states and local governments deciding what places are sensitive, and then the federal government doing background checks? Do you have a sense of what goes to what level of government? It's a big, broad question, but
yeah. I mean, I think, and I'm not going to give a great answer, perhaps, but I think we should have a broad federal framework that supports the NICS, database and supports good background checks and has some kind of universal gun safety laws and red flag laws and everything. But that being said, again, it's moot now because of the Supreme Court cases, but I think every state, it should have been left to common law in every state to decide. And my wife is not a gun person either, and she gets so worked up about it. And I'll say to her, well, you need to understand how someone feels about a gun in Massachusetts is different than how they feel about a gun in Michigan, and it's certainly different than how they feel about a gun in Mississippi. Right, so our state our country is a big country, a lot of different viewpoints, and so I think there's some value in state and community specific laws under the guise of a federal framework that could help ensure some minimal level of background checks
We've talked a lot about the complicated politics, and I know we're going to open it to all of you in a second. Around this issue, can you talk about how this legislation passed in Michigan that you were working on? And I guess you were asked to talk to Republicans and about the bills, and so a lot of states are deregulating guns, and Michigan here passed a package of what I would call mainstream gun control policies. How did that happen?
Well, the Democrats control the legislature and the governor's office. That was a good starting point. But that being said, the margin of control in the state house particularly is slim. So I think the governor had to make sure Democrats, that were in swing districts were okay with it. Whitmer's coming off a big re-election in 2022 against an opponent who still hasn't conceded the election, but that's another story. But our state party chair now is someone who's an election denier, and the state party's so broke it can't pay the rent. So, but that's another story too. So I think she had a lot of wind behind her back coming off the re-elect. I think we had a state legislature that was democratically controlled. We had the Oxford shooting, which was horrifically tragic a few years ago. Then we had the Michigan State shooting, and Whitmer put a lot of political capital behind it and got it done. And I think she's someone who has national ambitions, so I think she made it a priority so she could, and I guarantee in 2028 when she runs for president that she'll be talking a lot about the fact that Michigan got gun control done when the country couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
The Michigan example, some of you may know this, and certainly it'll be close to home for you, literally close to home. The governor, of course, subject to a kidnap and potentially murder plot involving some people who had intersections with the folks who were involved in January 6th. Also, the Michigan State House was overrun with not a violent, but a very heavily armed group, people with tactical vests, AR-style sort of rifles. For many of us, I think, who are not directly involved in politics in the sense of being elected officials, it feels like guns and politics are coming into direct contact in ways that might not have even been true when you stood for election the first time 10 years ago. Is that your sense too? I mean, literally, physically, hundreds of armed people in the Michigan legislature, which ended its term a day early because of this interference. Does it feel that way?
I think that's true. I think, I left in 2019, and I think it's gotten exponentially worse since I left. I think Trump has blessed and encouraged violence. And, starting with Charlottesville, some good people on both sides. It's just crazy talk. So I think the Trump MAGA folks have, at least some of them have said, violence is an okay tool to use to try and affect policy, which is obviously wrong.
Should we, I think, obviously, Kristen and I could keep asking questions here, but I see a lot of interested faces. Anybody have a question that you'd like to ask?
Thanks so much. I'm curious whether you think mass shootings receive outsized attention in Congress compared to, say, homicides and suicides, which make up most of them. Because the mechanisms that would affect gun suicides and gun homicides are things like making sure that legal guns are stolen, which I think Bill Hook's work and, say, John Donahue's work shown. But I think it's important to probably get rid of bump stocks, but it's a drop in the ocean.
Right. Yeah, I think they both. Again, that was another Republican kind of mantra, which is it's a mental health problem. And oh, by the way, most of the gun violence is not mass shootings; it's suicides and homicides. But it's hard not to talk about the school shootings when it affects your community because you lose one or two kids, and it's like this. How can this happen? This is just tragic. And so I don't know if I think in response to your question, I think it receives the appropriate amount of attention given the magnitude of the tragedy, but you're correct. It's certainly not the bulk of the problem, right?
Do you think that maybe more attention should be paid to the mechanisms that lead to homicide and suicide?
Yeah, I think we're going to get a Supreme Court case probably. There's an argument next month on the whether Bruin, whether someone under a restraining order for domestic violence should be able to have a gun, right? And so if you follow Clarence Thomas's reasoning, given the fact that up until 1920 there were states in our country that allowed men to beat their wives. Right. I read an interesting quote, Blackstone, way back when, the great legal thinker said, women, once they're married, lose their essence and their being is suspended. They're not people anymore. They're just wives. So if you follow that traditional historic precedent, you would think that the Supreme Court's going to say, absolutely, a wife beater should be able to have a gun. Right? So I guess I'm off topic, editorializing again, but I think it's... absolutely. That's so. In my opinion, if there's homicides with guns, we got to figure out why they're happening. If it's domestic violence, you don't get to have a gun. That's pretty logical to me. So.
This case, I saw two hands, so I don't want to, but just to jump in for anybody who's not a law student or maybe not following this case, this is United States versus Rahimi. It's being argued on Tuesday, November 7th, and actually the next Center for Firearms Law event will be unpacking the oral argument in Rahimi. And just as Dave describes, the issue is whether it's constitutional to deny guns to people who are subject to certain kinds of domestic violence restraining orders, a law that was passed in 1994. Does not have the direct historical tradition support that some others might. And as David sort of alluded to earlier, the test adopted by the court in last summer's decision, or 2022's summer case called Bruin, says that gun laws today, in order to be constitutional, have to be consistent with historical tradition. It's not about how many lives they save or how many people they protect from terror, but whether they're consistent with that kind of Blackstonian history.
So women were chattel, so therefore gun violence against women should be fine.
So one of the things that I think is interesting with gun policy making is the kind of side doors that could be used or are sometimes used to affect gun policy. And one of the things I think is interesting is how the ATF's been accused of being a captured agency and underfunded, and that Congress is like purposefully hobbling the ATF. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to like what is happening behind the scenes on the ATF. Like, is that an articulated goal of just trying to like keep gun laws from being enforced, or are there other things happening in regards to the ATF behind the scenes?
Yeah, I think I can't speak to it personally, but I can give you my opinion just kind of watching how politics has evolved in the last 4 or 5 years. There's all kinds of concern about, in fact, if you look at Mike Johnson's background, our new speaker, perhaps, he has a lot of conspiracy theories that he's promulgated in this deep state. And I believe me, every bureaucrat, in my opinion, is not pure and beyond reproach, and they have their agendas. That's for darn sure. But I think it wouldn't surprise me if there's a concerted effort to not only defund justice and to undermine the integrity of our courts, but also to try and make sure ATF doesn't have the resources to do their job, because there seems to be instead of trying to fix an agency that maybe isn't doing their job well, the solution now is to defund them. And that's, either the agency, if it doesn't serve a purpose, should be eliminated, or if it's not doing its job, maybe hold back some money, but let's fix it. And no one seems to want to do that, right? So I think you're probably right.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I'm actually really curious about you've mentioned several times that you follow the constitutional developments in this area very closely, and that you have read cases including Bruin, and that's sort of been encouraging to me to hear, because I think of like the departmentalist aspect of the role of the legislatures and also the executive in understanding constitutional imperatives as a really important one. I'm kind of curious, what is your perspective in terms of what are the obligations, particularly at the state level, for a governor to interpret Bruin or similar Supreme Court decisions for themselves and come up with framework that they feel falls within that scope? And if so, how does the historical research and weight aspect of this current court's trajectory play into that work?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. So if I was, I'm now a Florida resident, okay? Because I sold the business in 21 and I became a resident in Florida before I sold it and saved some tax dollars. Okay? Don't apologize for that. So we have this governor in Florida, and now I'm going to go off topic here. So I'm going to tell you a quick story. So I got called by Politico, the magazine. I'm going to get to your question. It's a great question, and I got a great answer for you. So you're going to like it. So I get called by Politico, and they said, "We heard you have an interesting story about Ron DeSantis." And I said, "Oh, where'd you hear that from?" He goes, "Oh, we're not going to tell you, but it's Mike Bishop, a former colleague of yours in Michigan." I said, "Okay." And I said, "I do have a good story about DeSantis." I said, maybe a couple of you saw this, but so I got appointed in the 114th Congress, my first time in Congress. I got appointed to the Foreign Affairs Committee. Got appointed to Judiciary and Foreign Affairs. And I was the first member of the 114th Congress by the steering committee put on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Nothing significant to that. My name came up. They said, "Where should we put Trott?" And I went to meet with Boehner. And Boehner's a buddy of mine. We played a lot of golf over the years together. So I'm in the speaker's office. He's the other one smoking in his office. There's no smoking in the Capitol. He didn't have any red wine. It was early in the morning. And he said, "All right, Trott, what committee you want to be on?" So I'm a speaker. My whole background is financial services. I want to be on the Financial Services Committee. I got a good solution for Freddie and Fannie and the GSE reform. And okay, good to know. Okay, you're going to be on Judiciary and Foreign Affairs. Okay, so I get on. So I got put on there again. Just my name came up. I was the first person put on there. Ron DeSantis was the last person put on the Foreign Affairs Committee by the steering committee in the 113th Congress. The significance of that is DeSantis and I sat next to each other like this for 2 years. Because it's a crowded committee. Okay, so I get to my very first committee hearing as a member of Congress, and I'm excited. I've done my work. I don't know who we had in front of us that day, but I've got my questions, and I'm real junior, so I'm going to get my 5 minutes, like an hour 4, but whatever. And so I'm sitting there, and DeSantis comes and plops down next to me, and I look at him, and he looks up, and he starts putting his hand. So I better not bother him. He's getting organized, and I'm the newbie, right? For 2 years, the man never said a single word to me. finally, after about the fourth hearing, I said, Ron, I'm Dave Trott from Michigan. Oh, hi. Never, that was it. Oh, hi. 2 words to me. That was it, right? So I'm telling the story to Politico, and I said he's arrogant, he's aloof, he's not likable, blah, blah. And the reporter said to me, and this is my defense to my wife, who was not impressed, and the reporter said to me, so basically, Dave, you think he's an asshole? And I paused, and I almost said, well, I wouldn't use that word, and I said, yeah. So that had about a 10-day shelf life, and I stand by it because it's true. So anyway, our governor has said if he's elected president, he's going to eliminate the ban on bump stocks. That was 3 days ago in Iowa. So he's not doing well in his campaign. I'm going to get to your question. So now he's going as far right as he can. No one's going to get further right of Ron than Ron, so he can get back going in the presidential primary. If I was governor of Florida, and there's an election in 2026, he's term limited, but just saying. If I was governor of Florida, I would hire Joseph to come and tell me how to write a law that could survive our 6-3 Supreme Court, that would do some of the things we're talking about. That's what a governor needs to do, is they need to operate within the realm of the world they're in, because these justices aren't going anywhere anytime soon. And I would come up with a law that hopefully could satisfy a constitutional challenge, which is most certainly coming.
Mm.
From your mouth to the justice's ears.
I'm curious about your thoughts, on the congressional level, about where we go from here. Because obviously, the NRA is going bankrupt. They clearly still have an immense amount of political power. Gun executives and gun hunters have a massive amount of political power and financial capital within our political system. So how do we begin to dismantle that and actually make any change in Congress?
So I was part of the Problem Solvers Caucus, the moderates, Republican. To join the Problem Solvers Caucus, you had to pair off with someone across the aisle. So Debbie Dingell, a moderate from Michigan, Democrat, and I went in together. And, I'm disappointed because I thought what might happen if this speaker's race, and when maybe some of you have gotten updates on it, I'd be curious to see what's happening. What I hoped would happen is that the Freedom Caucus candidate, Jordan, and his disciples would not succeed. And then the moderates would go cut a deal with Jeffries. We'd have a Republican speaker. We're not going to have, Jeffries as a speaker, but we'd have a Republican speaker who was moderate, who could work with the folks across the aisle to get some things done on whatever topic we want to talk about. Guns would be one. And but that's the Freedom Caucus at least won this round. And again, so nothing will get done the rest of this Congress. There's no bill. I'd be lucky if the government's open in a month, right? Yeah. Yes, sir.
You talked a lot about kind of weighing the need for meaningful reform with the political tenability of it. And I think one solution that's been proposed has been eliminating the gun liability loophole that many manufacturers enjoy. Why is that not politically tenable for residents or for constituents of the Congressman, or is it?
Well, I think so now we're looking at the powerful money and lobbying power that would not let that happen. And the NRA has made a lot of money since Heller, and I don't think they would allow that loophole to be eliminated. So I don't think corporations making guns are going to be helped.
This loophole, by the way, for anybody who doesn't know, this is the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act passed in 2005, which insulates the vast majority of gun-related manufacturing and selling from the kinds of tort liability you might see kind of in other areas.
An interesting dynamic that could affect the politics is we're working on something. New Jersey has a case pending. Michigan's working on it. Wisconsin's working on it, particularly in purple states, Pennsylvania, and to restore, and New York has it, to restore fusion voting. And so the way fusion voting works, because most third parties are irrelevant, they're a spoiler, right? And I'm involved a little bit in the no labels effort, and we'll see how that plays out, but they could ultimately end up being a spoiler, because even though they think they can get to 270, I don't see how they get to 270. I think they win a couple states and maybe throw it into the House of Representatives under the 12th Amendment, and that would really be a disaster on how they're being run right now, right? So, but the fusion voting, it would encourage more moderate solutions, in my opinion. It would get rid of the extremes on both sides. So let's take our Michigan right now. We have an open Senate seat because Stabenow is retiring. Mike Rogers is running as a Republican. He'll probably be the nominee. Alyssa Slotkin will most certainly be the Democratic nominee. Then you'd have a third party, the Fusion Party. It's called the Common Sense Party in Michigan. And they would not run anyone in their own ticket. They would interview Rogers and Slotkin. And they would ask them questions about abortion and immigration and debt and guns. And they would be looking for more moderate solutions than the extremes. And then they would pick one of those folks, and that would be their nominee. So you'd go into the voting booth, and you'd have three candidates potentially for the U.S. Senate. You'd have Slotkin, the Democrat, Rogers, the Republican, Slotkin, the nominee for the Common Sense Party. The vote totals for the Common Sense Party and the Democratic Party would be added together. So if I'm an independent moderate, which is 20% of the voters potentially in Michigan, if not more, and I walk in and I'm not happy with the extreme right or the extreme left, I'm going to look at that Common Sense Party and go, I like their ideas and what they stand for. And over time, what would happen is both parties would say, gosh, we keep losing these elections by 6 points. It's because that damn Common Sense party's getting globbed onto the other totals. We better get more moderate candidates in the field. It would kind of change the dynamic potentially, and we'll see. It's worked to that extent a little bit in New York, I think, in some races, and they don't run a candidate in every race.
So we somehow got to an hour, and I like to end on positivity and common sense. So maybe we'll wrap it up here. Please join me in thanking Dave for being here.